we have a special edition of the Reminger Report podcast on emerging technologies. I am excited to introduce a special guest, Devin Miller. Devin, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to a good conversation.
We are very excited to have you here. We appreciate you taking the time. Now, before we jump in and kind of start talking about it, I'd love for you to kind of give us some background about yourself. We obviously see the science behind you, helping startups and small businesses and innovation, Miller IP Law, intellectual property for those that don't know. But tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're a lawyer by training, but kind of tell our guests, who it is that you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, and that's a whole long conversation in and of itself. So I'll try and give you a bit of the shorter version of it. So kind of by heart, I have two things that I love. One, or I guess more than two things. I love my family. They're the most important. So I have a wife, been married for 14 years, have 4 kids, ages 11 to 6. And so that's the most important thing in my life. To switch over to the business side of my life, my two passions are startups and startups/entrepreneurship and the law. And so that's kind of, if you're to look at the path that I've taken, it always kind of goes back to I love both, or I have passion about both of those. And so, kind of starting off educational career as far as on the college side. So I got 4 degrees, which my wife always jokes is 3 degrees too many. But I got a electrical engineering degree, a Mandarin Chinese degree. And then as I was getting, my emphasis was always more on the electrical engineering degree. But as I was getting to the end of the undergraduate and I was kind of figuring out what I want to be when I grow up, I came to the conclusion I liked engineering, but I didn't want to be an engineer, in the sense that I didn't want to be stuck on a project for a long period of time and work. A lot of engineers, to have any say in a company or have any impact, you have to stay with them for a long period of time or have a lot of experience. I'm saying, hey, I don't want to work 10, 15 years of my career before I ever get to see what I'm working on or really understand it or have any impact on it. So that's kind of where I said, what do I want to be when I grow up? And kind of said, I love entrepreneurship, startups, and I also love the law. And so I said, well, I could go do an MBA and get it, in the business side, or I could go get a law degree. I said, rather than choose one or the other, I'm just going to go straight down the middle and do both. So I ended up getting an MBA degree as well as a law degree at the same time, and then really been chasing both passions ever since. So I've been a full-time lawyer now for about 10 years. I've also been doing the law thing full-time, and I'd say, side hustles are really a second full-time job. I've also done several startups, everything from small, family businesses that make tens of thousands a year up to 7- and 8-figure businesses as well. So that's about me in a nutshell, as much as I can put it in a nutshell, but that's a little bit about me.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And I think it helps to provide some context, both, not only for myself, but for our listeners, right, because one of the things that I always talk about, right, is that everybody approaches things a little bit differently. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful is to have that background and explanation when we hear about how people are approaching things. It's helpful to say, this is how I'm approaching it, but let me tell you my background as to why I'm approaching it this way. And so I think that's immensely helpful, for our listeners. Now, you talked about kind of the background in law, full-time lawyer for the last 10 years, a bunch of startups. How did you kind of start out your career when you first came out with the MBA and the law degree? How did you kind of get started in this space?
Yeah, it probably goes a bit back to while I was still in school. And so, as I was in school, I was kind of, just to set up the stage or the context a bit. So I was doing the law degree and the MBA degree at the same time. Had a 2-year-old at the time, had a newborn at the time, and I was working about 20 hours as a law clerk. And then I also, as if that wasn't enough, decided that, I saw a flyer. It was either a flyer or an email, I can't remember which, but it was basically saying, hey, there's a business competition. You can come join some multidisciplinary where you get a whole bunch of different people together that you don't know each other, that they're studying different things, put them all together and see what business ideas you come up with, and you enter the competition. So formed a group one year. We did an idea that was kind of fun, but never was going to go anywhere. It made gym bags less smelly. We came back around and did a second, or got together. We were all juniors at the time, or in our third year of school, got together for our last year and said, hey, what do we want to do this again? We did. we went into decided after a lot of stupid ideas of brainstorming that I came up with the idea to do a wearable hydration monitor. Back in the days when they didn't have wearables, didn't even know Fitbit wasn't around, Apple Watch hadn't been thought of yet. And so that's really probably where I got my start on entrepreneurship. So I was chasing the law side of it and doing the MBA at the same time, but I also did that. From that, the short story is entered in the competition, took second place, although I think we should have got first, but started a business around it, bought out the other partners or the people in the competition with me, started a business around it, raised some money, did some further development over a few years, ended up merging with another company that one's still around. And right now it's an 8-figure going on 9-figure business. And so I was always chasing the law, doing that full time. When I graduated, I was a full-time attorney, and then doing some of these entrepreneur things on the side until about 3.5 years ago, where I started my own law firm. Also wanted to be able to navigate or be able to kind of consolidate everything I was doing. So the side hustles and the legal, I can mend into one business and one company and one effort. And so I started that about 3.5 years ago. So that was a much longer answer to a short question. I don't know how to make it any simpler because it's a messy thing, but that's a little bit about how I got started while I was still in school, and then kind of continued to graduate, become a lawyer, work for some law firms, worked for them for about 7.5 years, started my own thing. And the whole time I was also doing the entrepreneur, doing startups alongside of that.
I think it's great when lawyers, and we've talked to a number of lawyers on this podcast throughout. And I mean, I love talking to lawyers just because, I mean,
well, you're a select bunch. Most people will try to avoid lawyers as much as possible.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is just because I am a lawyer myself. So I'm happy to discuss, tech issues with other lawyers who are in the tech space, because oftentimes, we find a lot of lawyers who you don't find a lot of lawyers in the tech space, or you don't find as many. And so you find a lot of lawyers who are adjacent to the tech space, because they're, transactional lawyers, or they're litigators, or they're adjacent to it. But I love talking to lawyers who are actually in the tech space. And, I also love it too, just because one of the things that I know a lot of young lawyers or law students who may be listening to this podcast, they oftentimes ask, what else can I do with my career or my law degree other than traditional business? And I said, well, there's actually a lot of things, and we've had a lot of, lawyer guests on this podcast who were saying, well, look what I've been doing. And it's really interesting stuff, right? And I always say that the analytical approach that you learn in law school is applicable to a lot of different situations. Startup businesses is oftentimes one of them. So tell us a little bit, you answered and kind of how you ended up in the tech space, at least initially. Explain to us, I know you said you've got your firm, Miller IP Law, kind of keeping everything under one roof. Tell me, what are some of the services? Well, tell me first, I know a lot of people like to know, where are you located, right? Because I'm in Columbus, Ohio, but where are you located? And tell us about some of the services your firm is kind of offering.
Yeah, and I almost went to school near Columbus. I went to Cleveland, Ohio, when I did the graduate school for the law degree and the MBA. So I went to Case Western Reserve there. So nearby where you were at for a few years. But now I'm located. I was originally from Utah. I'm back in Utah most of my life, with the exception I've lived in Taiwan for a couple of years and went to school in Cleveland for graduate school. But I'm in Utah. So we're located in a smaller town. It's called Ogden, Utah. It's just north of Salt Lake City, but definitely an awesome place, and love being here.
And tell us kind of what some of the services, that your firm, well, yeah, I mean, I am assuming it's intellectual property, some patent work and along those lines, especially given your engineering background. But tell me, is it limited to that? Are you helping or consulting, with startups in other capacities?
Yeah, so do several things. So I would say the mainstay of the focus, or kind of the core competency, is on intellectual property. So patents, trademarks, copyrights. That's kind of when I started my own law firm, and even a lot of my career when I was focusing on the legal side. That's where I was focused. And so definitely have a core competency between myself and the other attorneys here. And we also will branch out a bit. So we'll do LLC formations. We'll do NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, non or independent contractor agreements, employee IP assignment agreements. And so those are kind of business related services that oftentimes come along with that. And then in addition to that, and kind of not, I also own a engineering firm that does a lot of product development. So we'll help kind of on the, a lot of times startups and small businesses will come in, they'll have initial prototype or maybe a concept, and they're saying, hey, I want to protect this. And then, oh, by the way, do you know anybody that helps on the development side? And we're able to offer kind of both of those services under one roof. And then in addition to that, kind of on the law side has been branching out. One of the other things I think is an area that the legal side often lags behind, and that's a longer conversation, is on some of the DIY legal services. Now you have people like Rocket Lawyer, LegalZoom, but for the most part, the traditional law firm model is such that, hey, we're the attorneys, you either don't have them, you don't have enough money to afford us, we're going to leave you out in the cold and you have no options, which I understand why they do that. Or it's going to say, hey, pay our fees. And for a lot of startups and small businesses, you're kind of left with between rock and a hard space. Don't really have the funds or the budget right now to afford an attorney, but also need some of those at least initial services to get started. So we've also, in addition to the law firm, as part of the efforts, we've done a DIY legal product that we're able to offer for those that are getting started. Doesn't replace an attorney, but it does provide an additional option for startups and small businesses as they're getting started.
Can you explain to our audience what some of those services might look like, or if I was coming to look for, what might I see?
Yeah, so we actually offer quite a few different ones. And so, some of the ones you'd see, you can do a trademark application. And, the way that we've set it up is it's, tooting our own horn, I guess, but, LegalZoom, and we looked at them. So some of these are offered by LegalZoom, but the problem is every time I'd see people that go to LegalZoom and they even tried to do it on their own and use their services, is it was complicated, it was hard to understand. There wasn't a lot of direction. It was this kind of wrote out script. And so we created a much larger suite, but it also, in addition to that, we're looking and saying, okay, what are the better ways that we can improve it? So we integrated video in there. We have explainers. We have a lot more information. At the end, they have an option to, if they're saying, hey, I'd like an attorney to pick up, where I left off, or it's too complicated, you can have an attorney pick up where I left off and go the normal route. Or you can buy in an hour of attorney time to get some direction. But as far as the services, you can do a provisional patent application, you can do a trademark, you can do a copyright, patent licensing agreement, cease and desist letter, LLC formation, NDAs, independent contractor agreements, business wills. Those are a good majority of that. So a lot of the services that we're saying that are going to be needed for a startup or a small business to get started, we offer it as a legal product. Now, not as good as an attorney, never claim it to be, because I think it's very hard to replace an attorney. But we try and fill in that gap as much as possible to make it as good of a product for those that are maybe can't afford us an attorney or afford attorneys.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we're starting to see, I think one of the issues that has existed and has been commented on, and I think you've touched on this, is the accessibility to legal assistance. And I know that that's been an issue, not just in the startup phase, but this has been an ongoing issue that I think a lot of people have talked about. Is the problem is complex. Problems like this are never simple or easy, right, to fix. But I think that what you're hitting at or talking about, I think, is one of those issues to try to decrease that barrier to access to legal assistance.
Yeah, well, I think there's two. I think one is there's always been that barrier. I don't think that's new within the legal realm. You go back, I'm sure 200 or 300 years, people are still struggling how to pay for legal services because attorneys have always been pretty expensive. Right. But I think that there's a couple things. One is you're trying to, typically, I always look at it as kind of like building a house. And you can, typically, if you need a shelter over your head, if you had to build something yourself, you could put up a tent. You could probably do it without a lot of instructions and you get it done. Or you can go hire.
I was going to say, you've actually never seen me put up a tent. So
theoretically, if I'll give you a really simple tent, it only has 2 poles. I'm sure you can figure that. My backpacking tent, I'll give you that one, or I'll show you that one. And I bet you can get that one to pop up. But you either have a tent. If you had enough time, if you had enough bandwidth, you could probably figure out how to do it yourself. and that's kind of doing it yourself. The typical, if I don't have an attorney and I have to try and figure it out, I may go watch some YouTube videos, or I may try and read something online. I'll get that bare essential tent over my head that keeps me out of the cold, or at least keeps the rain off of me if it rains, but doesn't do much more. Or you can go and you can have a contractor build your house, which is kind of more like an attorney, and it'll have all the amenities. It'll have the heating and the air conditioning, and it'll have the, electricity, and it'll have, all the amenities and nothing else. It's either you either get the tent or you get the house. And right. So one is that, it seems like there's there should be more of a middle ground to where you're not just left with one of those on the legal side of either having to try and figure out how to put up the tent yourself and having something, or having the house. And so that's kind of where I think that a lot of law firms are not addressing that need. And the reason being is they just want people to come in the door, pay the attorney rates, make the better amount of money off of it. Don't shy away from it. But I think the industry is moving that way, whether attorneys like it or not. You're having outside entities that are coming in, like LegalZooms, like Rocket Lawyers. I think it's going to continue to come. And so for me, it's either looking at, say, we can either continue to try and ignore it, push it off, pretend it's not there, and let the outside encroach in to the legal. And I'm not saying encroach in a bad way, but figure out how to solve the problems we're not willing to. Or we can start to say, hey, we already have a lot of this expertise and knowledge, and we're able to do it. Why not start to fill that gap so that we can continue to be, have a stable future? The other thing I think it's just one where technology has evolved to the point that we can do it a lot better now than what you could do 200 years ago. 200 years ago, right. There really was an ability to make a lot of those products, but attorneys and law firms are still thinking how it was done 100 years ago. And you look, and other than we use email and some docketing software and folder management, it really hasn't changed a lot. And I think that you have kind of at each generation, they just do it how the previous generation did it, how they learned it from their mentor or the attorney they trained under. And they never actually look to say, is there a better way or different way to doing this? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity, but a large degree it goes unaddressed. Yeah.
Now, one of the other things I know is you host a podcast too. Is that correct? So tell us about, because I like talking to people that host podcasts or have their own. So tell us about your podcast. How can our listeners find your podcast? What do you talk about? What do you address on your podcast? And what should we be listening for?
Yeah, so the podcast is called The Inventive Journey, and it really started out of, so as you can probably guess, first of all, I love startups. I also work with a ton of startups. If you can't tell by the sign, that's who we focus on, startups and small businesses. And a lot of the time when we were getting into it, I was hearing a lot of the same, first of all, I felt the same way myself, but I was hearing a lot of the same feelings that even though everybody has their own journey, there's a few things that are commonality. Everybody feels overwhelmed. Everybody feels like everybody else has it figured out except for them. You'll watch the movie, they'll read the book or the TV show, and it feels like everybody's an overnight success, and on and on. And then to not only compound it with you're having to wear multiple hats. You're having to do HR, you're having to do hiring, firing, product development, marketing and sales. You're the janitor, you're the boss, and everything in between. And so everybody kind of felt like, why am I the only one that's feeling these ways and overwhelmed and lonely and don't know how to do it? And so the podcast has really started from, I hear this a lot. There are a lot of people going through it. Everybody has a different journey, but they all have these same struggles. And so it's really telling the journey. We start at high school, college. So start from the beginning, and we'll talk through in about a half an hour how people got to where they're at today. And, maybe they went straight from out of college and did their own startup, or maybe they worked for somebody for 10 years and they figured they hated it. They tried their business, they failed. They tried another business, they were successful. They sold that, whatever that journey is. But we kind of tell the journey from the beginning so you can hear, hey, you're not alone. Other people have done it. Doesn't matter how old you are, what your education is. Everybody has a different path. And it's just a really fun conversation to hear how all the different people that are doing startups and small businesses, how they got to where they're at today. So it's on all the major podcast platforms. You could go find it on any podcast player. We're also on YouTube. You could also check it out on our website, so you can catch it about any way. But if you just go and search for the Inventive Journey, it'd come up pretty easy.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. I was going to ask, do you ever notice that your guests on the podcast, are a lot of them serial entrepreneurs, meaning they've worked on multiple projects, whether they've been successful or not? Or, do you get a lot of people who've been on, they struck it on the first time, or they've got one business and that's what they've stuck to?
all across. So we've done, I think now 350 episodes or more. And so I've talked with a ton of people. It's everything from people that have just getting started out and they're just getting into doing their first business. And so who knows, it's too early to tell, to people that have done it, they failed, they had to pivot, they adjusted, and they're on their third or fourth one, to people that are, getting ready to do their next successful one, to people that struck it on the big. And I don't know, it's interesting. I don't know that there's been enough of one or the other, because everybody's in a different place. I mean, there are people that struck it on the first, but even the people, and why I like the podcast, is even the people that struck it on the first, it still took them years. They pivoted, they adjusted. It's not like they had an idea, they went and implemented it, sold it in the marketplace, and everybody just started paying them lots of money. I don't think I've had any of those stories. What I have heard is, hey, I left my job, I was sick and tired of working for someone else, or I always had a dream or desire. I started this, we were in it for a year or two, figured out we had it all wrong, we needed to pivot, we adjusted, we changed the marketing, or we changed the product, that didn't work, and now after about 3 or 4 years, we kind of got it figured out now, and we're starting to be successful. And that is a much more realistic. And some people are saying, I've been doing this for 10 years and I still don't know what I'm doing, but I'm having a great time at it. So I mean, I think it's that one where some people are still with the first business they're at, and some people are doing serial, and everybody's business or everybody's journey is so different that I don't know there's enough of a commonality, because everybody has such different journeys and paths.
Yeah, I appreciate that.